See everyone coming in. Welcome everyone to the first of our 3-part Advanced Android Maker series, brought to you by our friends with Unity and of course GGP. These are also going to be available for you on YouTube as you want to share them or reflect on them or return to some of this learning. Just want to get to it. Everyone's time is super valuable. But yeah, we're just super grateful for you sharing this time with us and being part of the Discord community, all of it. So with that said, let's introduce our guests. Thomas Utsav from Unity. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Margaret from USC, professor. Mason, of course, programs, GGP. Let's get started. Let's start learning right now.
All right, I guess I gotta take over this screen share and push buttons. So, hey everybody, welcome to the first. We're doing 3 of these. This one is going to be about crossing the finish line and planning for success with your application. Right, it's a big deal when you're trying to get anything across the finish line, whether it be a new comic book you're writing, or in my case, trying to read. I have to schedule my reading, things like that. Or if you're trying to build an application, a game. These are big undertakings, right? And you want to make sure that what you do is plan and set yourself up for the best success possible. So let's start off the jump, who we are. So I'm Thomas Winkley. I work at Unity. I'm a technical marketing advocate, which means I know how to use the engine pretty well. And I like to talk to people. And then I guess Margaret, since I started with me, we'll go the backwards way. So Margaret, you're next.
Go right to left, a valid way to go. Hi, everybody, and my name is Margaret. I'm an associate professor here at USC Games. We have one of the leading programs in game design, game production in the country. We've been around for several years, and my role here is teaching game development and production.
Thank you, Margaret. And last but not least, my name is Utsav. I am a product manager here at Unity. I used to be a game developer. I've been a technical artist. I've been a software development consultant. I've worked on games like Outer Wilds. I've done work on Ruined King. I've done Marvel Strike Force. I've done Storyscape. Just been in the industry for a long time. That's all about me.
Still blows my mind that you have all those games under your belt, and I am much older than you. So first things first, if you're not already in there, we'll drop this link. Oh no. I clicked. Okay, let me grab this and copy and link address right here. So this is the Discord for this community. So please jump in, join. That's where you'll interact. I'm in there. I believe Margaret's in there. I believe Utsav's in there. So as that things change and there's more content and stuff and things pushed out, that's kind of how you're going to find everybody and interact with your peers. And the cool thing about events like this, in my opinion, is there's like networking friends to be made, right? And that's one of my favorite parts about it, especially the gaming community in general, whether you're playing them or making them. Everybody wants to get to know each other and become friends. So you should do that. All right, another thing I want to talk about. So there's going to be discussion of certifications at some point. I know that's kind of being discussed. So I just wanted to talk about these really quickly. These are the Unity certifications as they live right now. So, if you're at high school or it's your first time, we have the user certifications, whether it be programming or digital artist. Then we have the certified associate, which is the next step when you're moving into that college or, getting into that career. That's where you're going to have an associate programmer, game developer, artist. And then we have the certified professional and certified expert. So that's kind of how we think about certifications as they sit right now. And so as you hear about certifications, I just wanted to make sure you knew those are kind of the 4 buckets that we're all thinking of over here. So I want to start off with something very important that, I was having a really in-depth conversation with Rihanna about project management and production of games. And, she really hit me with a big one of a goal without a plan is just a wish, right? If you don't have a plan laid out, you don't have it set up, then you're not ready to get things done and set it up accurately. Now, what's interesting is I shot back because I'm also a knowledgeable fella. And I told Rihanna, you're right, but game development is also product development. And I want to be very clear on that because this was kind of like one of those aha moments I had at GDC a few years ago. I was sitting watching the panel on the postmortem of Doom 2016, and they were just talking about their design process and their iterative flow. And they were really focusing on their combat system, right? Which, based on their combat system, it's very different. It forces you to engage the game in their way. And they talked about, they didn't test for, did the players say, I'm having fun, which was interesting because usually that's what we aim for. And they didn't test for, are the players finding things? They specifically tested for, are they playing the game the way we intend them to play it? And are they engaging with the mechanics we build? Which, if you've ever done any research on product management, you'll find that that's actually what product managers do, right? They look for an outcome and then they build based on that outcome. And so just kind of built this huge, like, full circle piece for me. And so I really wanted to make sure that Rihanna knew that, and all of you as well. A quick question, because I almost forgot to ask. I want to make sure, in the chat, on a scale of 1 to 3, 1 being I know what a game engine is, but haven't used one, and 3 being I have published applications. What's everyone's skill level? How y'all feeling? Like, for example, I'm going to put myself at like a 2 because I've never actually shipped anything, but I've made a lot of prototypes. I think Margaret and Utsav would be a 3. Got some 2s. All right, cool. All right, perfect. Okay. So we're at a good middle ground then. Awesome. The reason we asked that is we have this whole presentation built out, but if for some reason all of you were like, we've actually shipped 7 games and I'm dialing in from my AAA studio right now, we'd probably have a different conversation. So I just wanted to make sure we set level where everyone is. So really quickly, I'm going to define a couple of terms here before the actual pros take over. So we're going to talk about minimum viable product, right? Or MVP. And what this is an early version of your product, right? It's designed to ensure that it does what you want and it actually meets the market needs you're trying to satisfy. This applies in games. A lot of times in games, we call a minimum viable product a vertical slice, or at least part of that. And so we'll talk more about that as we go on. Another term we're going to talk about is a scope creep, and I'm really interested to know how many people actually know this Radiohead song. It's really popular, but I find when I drop musical references into presentations, people are like, I don't know what that means, Tom. I legit made a Shania Twain reference last night and had 10 people tell me they didn't know who Shania Twain was, and I had no idea what to do with that information other than feel real weird. So the scope creep is basically the idea that you keep adding features and you keep figuring out cool things you want to do with your project or product or application, and then suddenly your scope or what you need to build and deliver just gets real big and it slowly creeps, right? It gets bigger. It turns into a weirdo. And so as you're trying to figure it out and build it, suddenly your timelines are all out of whack and you might even get overwhelmed and not be able to get in and get it done the way you want it to, right? So another thing we'll talk about a lot, if y'all haven't used these, are game design documents. You can also do product design documents, technical documents. I'm a huge believer in these, mainly because these help keep you on task and manage your time and workflow. They're also really important, not just to make them when you start, but when you make changes, you should go back and document those changes. And it's not a bad idea to tell yourself why you made that change. The last thing you want to do is you're 8 months into production, you're running into a problem, you've made this change, and suddenly you can't remember why it's important anymore. Right? That can be a problem. So documenting your work and making sure you're writing stuff down. And I posted some examples here. I'm sure we'll share this deck out, but it was really fun for me to jump through and start reading some of my favorite games, right? So if you look at this right one, this is the Diablo Bible or pitch deck. And if you look at that diagram on the right-hand side, that is exactly the game mechanics of Diablo. Like, I have never looked at an image before and gone, that's exactly what this game is. But you've got the town and you've got this layer cake of a temple that you just keep going down and it gets harder and harder, right? And I just thought that was such an incredibly apt way to describe the game because you look at it and you can already see the world layout. BioShock was another interesting one for me. It's my all-time favorite game series. It's so good. But the cool thing is that Bible is like, I think it's like 18 pages long, and I read the whole thing. And at the end of it, I went, that's not the game I played. Like, the actual pitch deck for BioShock and the final product don't really line up. The only thing that lines up are these statements right here where it's like, BioShock will do this, do this, do this. And truthfully, the biggest thing it lined up is it told a mature, terrifying story, and it scared the hell out of people. Hopefully I'm allowed to say that on the internet. I don't have a lot to say about the Doom Bible other than like it's a really, really old classic game design doc. You can see scribbling in the margin from the scan. It's got ASCII art in it. It's a really fun romp down history if you want to see that. So with that, I'm going to be real quiet now. And I think Margaret's going to take us through pre-production, prototyping. We'll kind of dive from there.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. I share your experience of dropping musical references and realizing that no one gets them. It's hard. It's a hard life. Good. So part of what I teach here at USC Games is our production class. And production in the context of games means something a little different than it does for movie producers. It's a little different from project management. It's almost as though you combine those two things. So production means how do you get the thing made is basically the way to summarize it. It's all of the processes that you use and kind of how do you set a schedule, how do you use milestones and experience goals and a lot of other tools to develop your idea and deliver something that is a complete game on time, whatever that might mean for your project. So I'm going to kind of zip through the slides here. We're going to have this available later if you want to look at the recording and see kind of more detail, because I put a lot of words on the slides, and I'm not going to make you sit there while I read it, right? But I think there's useful stuff. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is not production though, but pre-production. This is part of a method called the Cerny method. You can look that up on the internet if you're interested to learn more. C-E-R-N-Y, Mark Cerny, gave a talk a very long time ago at this point that kind of changed how everybody made games. And in this talk, he said, we've been doing this all wrong. We've been making games in a way that doesn't actually make any sense. We need to spend more time at the beginning figuring out what we are making before we can really make a reasonable schedule for the thing we're trying to make. And that will help us to avoid scope creep. It will help us to avoid the inevitable expansion of games and software beyond the time that is available. And so we have this formal process now called pre-production. It happens before you really set a schedule for your game because, again, you got to figure these things out before you can know how long it's going to take you to make the thing. Pre-production can be kind of short if you're making something that's similar to something that's already out there, if you're making something similar to something that you or your team has made before. In particular, you can make it a little shorter. If you're making something new and innovative and possibly a little weird, then you want to spend more time in pre-production because you have more questions to answer. Questions like, how does the player know what to do if they've never seen this kind of game before? So professional teams always build in some time for this kind of thing. It's not something that we skip. Next slide, please. And these are kind of the top level questions that you're trying to answer during this period. And Utsav is going to take over and talk about the actual production part and managing milestones and that kind of part of things. And I'm going to focus pretty strongly on pre-production because it is key to success. So at the top level, when you come out of pre-production, when you're ready to make your game, you have a good answer to all of these questions. What is the thing? What are we making? What is the product design? What are the experience goals within the game? We'll come back and talk about that. Can this team make it? Pre-production is a time when you get to kind of do a shakedown of your team and see if they have the right skills and tools and enough time to do the thing that you have in mind. And then how, meaning like this is where you actually do figure out what kind of meetings are you going to have, what kind of version control are you going to use, how are you going to set up your code, all those really big questions, you solve those in pre-production. And then once you've got everything kind of lined up and ready to go, that's when you can make a schedule. So real quick to ask you a question on that, because I first of all, I love the can this team make it question. Like that is such an important question of like, can we actually do this? What are there any tools that you recommend to document this type of thing? Is this just a Word doc? Or are you throwing it in like when you're starting to make these decisions of how, are there certain things you recommend? And then if the answer is no on the can this team make it, what do you recommend someone does? What a great question. How do you capture it? There's so much to capture that it can't really all live in one place. So for example, when you decide on your art style, you would typically document that using pictures, right? Like you would have pictures of the actual art style. Whereas your game design, you would typically use diagrams and verbal descriptions like in a game design document. And your meeting schedule, for example, would probably live in a calendar. So because games are complicated, multimodal things, you end up generating a lot of stuff during pre-production that helps define kind of what you're about. What do you do if your answer is no? You've picked something that's just too big, you can't make it. You have three things you can do. You can cut it down and make it smaller so that you can make it. You can add resources if that's available to you. If you have, I don't know, an extra $1 million lying around and you want to like bring in a contractor to finish it, cool, do that. Or you can add time to the schedule. Those are pretty much your three options. You can add resources, or you can make it smaller. Nearly always the right answer is to make it smaller. And there are good ways that you can do that and still get across the thing you want as long as you know what the thing is that you're trying to make. So again, this is the part I'm going to kind of zip through, but I'm trying to give some examples of these are the real questions you got to answer pretty much for any game or any app. Some of these are a little more game specific, but you'll see that the approach also applies for apps and other types of interactive work. So overall, what is it going to look like? once I make a model and I put it into the engine, is it actually going to look good? How are people going to make a model and get it into the engine? What are we going to name our files? All of these things are art questions. Next slide. For engineering, you want to make a lot of class diagrams. Speaking of different ways to capture your decisions, class diagrams are a way to diagram your code and plan it and make sure it's going to cover all the things that it needs to cover in a way that's hopefully flexible and abstract and ready to be expanded as needed. Every team has to have conventions about how they work together. This is the right time for sure to figure out if you want to use a tool, if you want to use somebody else's character editor or somebody else's dialogue system or whatever. This is the moment where you figure that out. And then you have the tools of development, like what's your version control strategy. Version control is the way that you make sure that your code doesn't fall apart all the time by saving previous versions. Continuous integration, DevOps, LiveOps, those are more technical terms that I don't need to get into, but all this stuff is what you got to figure out if you're going to get into actually making the game.
Yeah. And before we dive next slide, I just thank you so much for calling out that like naming conventions need to be decided before code starts getting written. As a developer, just thank you, because then your teams can actually work asynchronously more successfully because you know what variables are going to be called and you don't have to ask that person a bajillion times. I just want to thank you again, like 5 times for that.
And I'll plus one to that, because being a technical artists are not very great with naming things, because you'll generally see things like character final V2 and
.7.
yeah, and you see that a lot. So plus one to that. Yeah,
this is where you figure that out, right? You have the thing that you call it, whatever you call your file, whatever you want, technical artist. But at the point when it becomes the thing that you're giving to the team, you give it a particular name, you put it in a particular place, and that way you don't spin your wheels figuring out where are the files and which one and all that kind of thing. This is where you figure that out. Then you're probably working with a team. It's possible to make a game solo or an app solo, but usually there's some kind of team involved. And this is the part where you figure out who's on the team. How are you going to organize it? Are you going to have sub-teams? Will you have an engineering team and an art team? Will you have an art team that has a subset for character art and environment art? Somebody else for UI, all that stuff. You got to figure out who's doing what. If you're going to outsource anything, if you're in a position to do that, this is where you'd figure that out, hopefully. And then you just have all these kind of grindy little incredibly important details about how are we going to talk to each other, how are we going to structure our meetings so that they feel useful to everyone who goes, where is everything going to live, how are we going to keep track of our work using something like Trello or Jira. Just in general, how is everything going to work kind of mechanically to make sure everybody's kind of pointed in the same direction. Ideally, you will have someone who is a dedicated producer whose job it is to just make all that stuff work. Producing is a magical art, and if you know someone who's a good producer, do what you need to do to stay friends with that person. They're a priceless treasure. All right, and then of course you have your questions of game design. These are things that you need to figure out, again, before you can go into a real production. You need to know if your players understand what's going on in your game. Some developers will actually make this whole beautiful system and then figure out how to make the interface to it, with the result usually that nobody plays their beautiful system because they don't understand it. This happens a lot in student projects, unfortunately. Am I creating the experience I want? Again, we'll come back to that in just a second. And you can really figure out through testing and through talking to the team and just developing ideas, what are the most important parts of what we're trying to do? As you come out of pre-production, you need a sense of priority so that if you do need to make cuts, when you need to make cuts, you will know what you can cut without hurting the core of what you're trying to do. And then finally, does the game design, meaning like the crunchy little things of like, do you have a sword or a battle axe or something less violent? Does that fit what you're trying to do with the product? The product being, this is a particular genre made for a particular audience on a particular platform. Is this game going to work in that context? Do all those things kind of mesh together? And then let's talk about how you answer those questions. So sometimes the answers are given to you. Sometimes you've already invested in a bunch of libraries and tools, and that's how you make games, and that's cool. Sometimes your publisher will say, you know what, you've got to make this for Android 18. Sometimes you just have limitations if you don't have any money, and therefore you need to use the cheapest tools. There's a lot of things that can just already be figured out. Sometimes if you've made a game similar to it before, you can just do what you did before. It's worth asking, should I do it the same way? But often you can. And sometimes you can just decide based on what you've done before. I think this time we're going to do it this way. just based on my, 30 years of experience making games or whatever. I don't have 30 years. You can make choices just based on that. However, usually you still have a lot of stuff that you don't actually know, and everything else becomes a guess. Everything that you can't answer based on experience becomes something that you're just hoping will work. And that means it's a risk. That means that you might not actually make the right choice. So what can you do to minimize this risk? You can, and this is unfortunately the default choice, you can make everything, put it in the engine, finish all your art, finish all your code, finish all of your UI and everything, put it in the engine, and then find out if it does the thing that you want. That is a way of putting all of your risk together into one basket and pushing start and hoping it works.
Those are kind of like, you send fruit baskets when you want someone to feel better, and you send them a risk basket when you want them to have a bad day, right? That's kind of that's how those gifting strategies work. It's like, oh, let me just ship you a risk basket. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I'm imagining it on fire like a Viking ship.
Definitely.
But you can also mitigate the risk. You can also manage the risk by answering some of those questions up front using little quick tests. And those are called prototypes. So a prototype is something that is designed to answer a question. There's a popular misconception that a prototype just means like an early version of what you're trying to do. That is not correct. A prototype is a much more flexible idea than that. It is anything you make that helps you figure out what you are making. Typically, it is not actually your project. Typically, it's something you make and then throw away. Or you make and leave in your internal documentation somewhere so it still expresses something, but it's not something that actually goes into the final game. Just some terminology here. A high fidelity prototype is one that is closer to the real thing. So if you made a finished model and you were like, this is how we're going to do models in this game, 3D models, that would be a high fidelity prototype with all the textures and materials and lighting and all that stuff. Whereas a sketch on a piece of paper that gives you a general sense of like the silhouette and the shape and the color scheme and all that sort of thing, those are lower fidelity prototypes, which the next slide will make clear. Lower fidelity. Yes, there we go, the lo-fi beats girl. So low fidelity prototypes can be really dumb, really quick, really dirty, and still, as long as you choose them carefully, answer really important questions. A prototype is a way to manage risk, but it's also a way to just move forward as fast as you possibly can on your game without throwing away work, which is the worst possible thing if you make something and then you're like, oops, we shouldn't have ever made this. Let's throw away the last month of work. That's the worst. And prototypes can often help you avoid that. The best mentality to bring in at the beginning of a project particularly is a hacker mentality. It's what is the dumbest, cheapest, dirtiest, hackiest thing that we can make that will answer this question without expending a lot of time or resources or team energy. How can we just figure out if this thing does what we need it to do? And this is an example from a paper, which I'm going to show you again in a second, of someone who wanted to test a remote control ball. And what they did was they took a remote control truck and put it inside a ball. And then when you use the remote control, the ball rolls, right? Because the wheels are moving. And they were able to test the experience of using this kind of toy without actually making it, right? So they didn't have to fabricate a motor and all sorts of special bearings or whatever. They just threw this together and they're like, let's see if anybody even likes this before we invest millions of dollars in product development. A prototype, importantly, is not always in engine. So there's a lot of tools that you can use to figure things out that are not your game engine. For example, if you were making concept art, generally you don't do that in engine, right? Generally you get out Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever your paint program is of choice, you figure it out there, and the image that you make still answers the question of basically what is this going to look like? What's the kind of overall visual style? If you were to write a short story capturing the story of your game, that's a prototype, right? That helps you figure out some questions about character and perspective and plot and pacing. And you can learn a lot of things from a short story without coding an interactive story system. And a side note on that, which Utsav shared as we were working on these slides together, is unfortunately another common mistake to make a prototype in engine and then decide, okay, this is good enough, let's just use this as our project. When you had already made all these choices that were very intentionally hacky and terrible. And what that means is that you're starting off with what's called technical debt, meaning all the stuff you didn't clean up, right? All of the bad code that you wrote, all of the hard-coded things that you shouldn't have hard-coded. And that's dangerous, very dangerous. There should be a lot of alarm bells going off as you think about whether to do that. So same thing, a prototype is not an early version. Okay. I want to point you to, I'll just put a link to it in our chat. There's a paper by some Apple engineers named Stephanie Houdet and somebody Hill. I can't remember the first name, which you can just throw that, again, I'll put a link in the chat, but it's a really interesting paper that is about prototyping, that talks about how do you think about this process, how do you get better at prototyping, how do you get better at this process of answering questions quickly and not throwing work away. So I will make that available, and I'll put the link on Discord somewhere as well. And hopefully you will enjoy it. It has a lot of really wonderful hacky examples of how to answer questions in a dumb way. All right, and then at the end of pre-production, after you've done all of this prototyping and thinking and writing and working on what are the things that we're trying to do in the game, what is the experience we're trying to create in the game, does that fit with our product and our audience and so on, at the end of all of that, and you've like got your team working together, and you know how your pipeline works, you've got your files named correctly, all that stuff is ready to go. Now you create something that is called a vertical slice. And I don't have an image for it, but I want you to imagine a layer cake, right? A birthday cake, maybe it has, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 8 layers, if you're a good baker. I can sometimes manage 2 personally without having it slide off, but moving on. The idea is that when you're testing whether you're going to be able to make your game, you need to make something that is integrated, something that represents all of the different domains, all the different teams, all the different parts of your game. So you need your art in there, you need some representation of like your story, whether it's a single quest or dialogue or whatever. You certainly need some of your code to be in there. You need some of your mechanics to be in there. So it's an integrated piece, an integrated slice that has all those different layers in it. Because the main thing as you're making something as complicated as a game is it all going to work together? It is not guaranteed that it will. And so you make this thing called a vertical slice, and it forces your teams to work together. It forces you to work out how these different parts are literally going to make it into the engine. And it sort of serves as a shakedown of all of your different teams. And that is what you create. And that once you have something that represents all those different pieces, the moment of your game, usually from the middle, now you have a vertical slice. That's when you're able to say, okay, we're ready for production. And now that means what we are ready for is Utsav. Take it away.
Yeah. And before Utsav dives in, I want to add to the vertical slice piece really fast of like, this is also like, if you go to like a community showcase or a booth at a conference or a sales meeting where they're pitching a game, that vertical slice is also really instrumental in those pieces as well, right? Of like, this is my elevator pitch of a game. Anyway, I want to add that. Sorry, Utsav, go for it, brother.
No, thank you. Thank you for adding that. And thank you, Margaret, because I think I'm so glad you added technical debt and vertical slice and all of that in your slides, because one of my first things I did into game dev was rapid prototyping, and everything that you talk about here, learning that hands-on, you kind of really understand why these things are important. And again, I think Margaret, you did such a wonderful job of explaining that. I don't know how to follow that. Anyway, I will try. Okay. Eating the elephant. What does that even mean? It means that if you have to eat an elephant, you have to eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? So like Margaret mentioned, you've kind of identified your scope. You've identified how you're going to work together as a team. You've identified what tools you're going to use. But now it's time to actually execute. But execution doesn't happen right away. It doesn't. The work you've done was just the preliminary work to now come into an implementation, part of your project where you're hands-on, you're working, you're doing things. But you want to make sure things stay on track. You've identified how long it should take you, but how do you make sure that you stay on track? How do you make sure that scope creep doesn't show up? And I'm going to talk a little bit about how to manage that and make sure that you follow the boxes you've put yourself into. And those boxes are a good thing. I know a lot of times as creators, as somebody who has a creative leaning, being in a box doesn't feel great. It feels like you're being restricted. But a lot of times, I think that box brings out the creativity because you find different ways to solve the problem, right? Having constraints is, in my opinion, a propellant for your creativity, not something that diminishes it. Okay, so how do we stay on track? Going back to Margaret's point on the producers, organizational planning in a team of artists, technical artists, VFX artists, engineers, maybe in some cases external development teams is really not an easy task. In fact, it's a gargantuan task. And how do you manage that? Okay, so at least when I approach a project, I think of it in terms of milestones, right? You're not gonna be like, hey, we're gonna build a game, and in 9 months we're gonna have an end game, and you don't keep track of what's happening in those 9 months, right? That's a recipe for disaster, because there's so many moving parts. You're like, what should be finished first? Is this team reliant, is the art team reliant on my engineering team to finish a feature for them to see it in game and see how it looks so they can iterate on it? Is my engineering team reliant on my animation team so that animators can actually give them animations to implement and make sure timing works in games, right? All these questions need to be answered. So you follow a structure, and how you follow a structure is through milestones. So there are three primary milestones, and you can add as many milestones or take away some milestones if you don't think you need them, right? So for example, going back to Thomas's point of like game development is product development. Let's say you were making an app. That's still product development, but maybe you don't have a big, large content piece related to your app. Maybe you skip the beta, or maybe your beta includes a soft launch in a smaller market, right? So these are not set in stone. This is supposed to give you a structure that'll help you understand how to plan for these milestones and how to use them within your project to make sure that you get to the goal that you set for yourself in the pre-production phase. So I will talk about three primary milestones that I think are relevant, at least in game dev, and they go alpha, beta, live, or release. How does that work? Alpha is generally within the game dev circle feature complete, or what I mean by that is, let's say you're developing Doom. Your core features are character movement, your combat, and perhaps your enemy combat as well, right? Those are your core feature sets. You're going to design those first. You're going to white box it. I don't know how many of you looked at white box content, but that's how you're going to manage that. You're like, okay, these are the things we're going to focus on first. And at the same time, your concept art team is working on, hey, what does my character concepts look like, right? They're preparing the concepts for your 3D modeling team, your character modeling team, to take those concepts and turn them into real 3D assets, right? And that's alpha. And maybe some of your alpha complete includes your early character models, right? Maybe your early alpha doesn't include that at all. And you're like, hey, I just want to, make the features, make the gameplay, and have it all white box while my concept artists have time to really concept it out and have an iterative process, right? Again, you define what these milestones mean for you. The important thing is that you stay within the scope and that you execute on time, right? So that's alpha. What's beta? Beta is when you're pretty much content complete. So like, for example, I'm sure a lot of you, if you try out new games or if you're into playing new games, a lot of times you'll run into public betas. And public betas generally have two things. You have your feature complete on the gameplay side, and then you have your content complete, or at least core content complete, right? Let's say you wanted to have 100 levels in your game, but you've only made 10 levels and your initial release was 10 levels. So your beta is content complete. Yes, you're going to add more content later on, but that's not part of your initial milestone planning, and that's okay, right? It's okay, because you have to plan for yourself. So then we get to release. Hopefully between beta and release, what you're trying to do is really kind of resolve things, make sure your user experience is good, right? I think Margaret mentioned a lot of student projects suffer from lack of, user experience and UI planning. And I think hopefully you've done that before, and beta is your time to test it out and validate that with the user set, right? And once you're validating that, you're gonna get feedback. It's never going to be the case that you release beta and everybody's happy with it. There's no bugs. If that happens, you're doing something wrong, right? So hopefully during the beta phase, either you're already testing it or you have processes in place already that is going to take you to the release milestone, right? Which is the most important milestone, which is when you're ready for the world to see what you've created over however long it took you to create that. And hopefully you've kind of, managed that timeline accordingly and efficiently.
I want to ask a question for both of you on this, because you're talking about garnering feedback, right? And you have to take into account, like, say you're doing this from a beta and you've already put so much time and energy into planning, executing, prototyping. So what are tips y'all have for like taking that feedback and then continuing to build your game after receiving all of that feedback?
I want to hear what Utsav has to say about this, but here at USC Games, we make our students show things to testers long before beta, because you don't want that nasty surprise, right? You don't want to get pretty much to the end of the timeline and then find out that you have a totally ununderstandable UI or whatever. So earlier testing will help you avoid that situation. If you do get into a situation where your beta is just not really working, you got some tough choices to make. One is you ask for more time to fix it from your publisher or your team or whomever you need time from. Another is you rebrand it in some way and try to make it for a different audience. So for example, if you were making something that was intended to be a casual game and you find out it's actually really hard, through testing, you might just choose to rebrand it. You might say it's not a casual game anymore. Often your publisher won't let you do that, but it is an option depending on the exact problem you're having. Or in theory, I guess you could just launch anyway. Sometimes publishers will make you do that.
Fix it in post.
They do.
And you shouldn't, that's actually an important point, that like a lot of the games we see, when they have those issues, it's not the developer's fault if it's released with bugs, because it's not always up to the makers, unfortunately. But I really want to hear what Utsav has to say based on long industry experience.
Yeah, no, a lot of valid points there, and yeah, absolutely. I think your beta shouldn't be part of, like, if you're testing that, that shouldn't be your first testing. You like QA is something you also plan for, I think, in your project planning, right? I think QA is a very important, often overlooked part of game development, in fact, product development in general. And I think it is one of the more important pieces because they're the ones closest to what your user experience is going to be like, and they're going to provide you important feedback. And on top of that, I think there's a few things to kind of look out for, right? When you're trying to understand feedback. One is, what is the feedback? Is the feedback that there's kind of two ways to approach it, right? Because you could get the feedback, hey, this is garbage, and you need to change the whole thing, right? And then you kind of need to revisit it and be like, hey, does this really suck? Or is it a specific event that is happening that is causing my user to say that, right? Oftentimes, users are very kind of like, they only see what's happening right in front of them, and they don't understand what's causing that particular issue, right? So it's often important for you to find the cause and not just address the symptom. And I think that's a very important aspect. And second, and this is something I'll talk about in the future as well, is agility and agile process. So for a long time, computer software development used to be a waterfall kind of development. And what I mean by that, if any of you have taken any software engineering courses, I'm sure you've heard about this. Waterfall is, one milestone is over, you move on to the next one. You don't go back to the original one, but your milestone number 2 has a dependency on milestone number 1. You're going to finish milestone 1, you're going to go to milestone 2, and then so on and so forth. But an agile process is like, even though you go from milestone to milestone, you're iterating on those milestones all the time, right? And I think that's an important aspect, and you kind of have to think about that when you're building your game, in my opinion. I think hopefully your pre-production and prototyping has kind of shown you what elements are the elements that are probably going to garner different kinds of feedbacks, and you're going to need to change, and also how you're going to build a game which has like some sort of flexibility in changing things that you can change, right? So I think you kind of have, and another thing I would say is sometimes you have to have a thick skull. And what I mean by that is, you might think something is really fun. Yeah. I mean, you might think something is really fun, but your users may not, right? And you have to think from your user's point of view. So one of the hardest things that I did when building games and starting to learn games is, when I was in school, we'd show our games to industry professionals, and you just have to sit there and let them struggle if they can't figure out the controls and UI. You cannot tell them, hey, this is what you want to do, right? You've been working on it for 6 months, you know it like the back of your hand, but you don't want to tell them that, because you really need to step into your user's shoes to understand what their experience is. And that requires you to give up some of that, assumptions you have about your own game and features, and really kind of take your user's perspective and make it your own. Yeah, that's kind of it.
Thanks for that. I want to add one note too. If someone does say this is garbage for whatever reason, and you look and you can't find a root cause to that, it is totally within the realm of possibility that person's just being a jerk too. So you have to separate yourself from the game a little bit, I think. And I would just add a note of like, look at feedback from a critical eye of what is the intent of this feedback. And if the intent is actually to help and make things better, there's probably a root cause. If the intent is just to be a jerk, you might be able to skip past that and go to the next user, right? Because there's going to be more than one user giving you feedback.
Awesome. Cool. Okay. So moving on. We have milestone school. You're like, okay, you've given me a structure, but what if something happens? That's what we're going to talk about right now. What can impact your milestones? and how to kind of deal with it. And I'll talk about how to deal with it in the next slide. But this slide, I kind of want to focus on some things that obviously Thomas mentioned: scope creep. Scope creep. I can't talk about this enough. So I can give you a personal story of mine. And before I went into industry and worked on AAA and AA titles and mobile games, I was passionate. I wanted to make my own game. I started a studio. I got seed funding. We had a game idea. We put pen to paper. We got a GDD. We started working on a game, right? But we didn't find the game to be fun, so we went back and changed the game. Then we took another sprint. We worked on some more features. We were like, nah, this is not fun either. And then suddenly it was 6 months in, and we really didn't have something that we liked, and it was just getting bigger and bigger. We turned from making a mobile PvP game to now a PC PvE game. It was nothing alike, right? And it was because we didn't give ourselves constrained boxes and made sure that we implemented what we kind of initially decided on. We decided on those things for a reason. We proved it out, right? But we switched, we pivoted, and we let scope creep get in there. And I think, to me, that was a very important lesson, because a lot of people have great ideas. I remember when I was in game design class, one of my professors, he was like, how many of you think there's a job in the industry which is just an idea person? He's like, oh, your whole job is to just come up with game ideas or game design ideas. And some people, raised their hands. It was their first game design class. And he was like, I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but that's not a job. Nobody's just going to pay you to come up with ideas. Everybody has ideas, right? It's about implementation and execution. Not to say you have to execute on a bad idea. First you go through prototyping and pre-production and make sure, validate your assumptions about your ideas, but your execution matters. Bad execution of a good idea is not going to net good positive results for you. But a mediocre idea, very well executed, may yield positive results. And that's something I want you to keep in mind, because execution in the game dev world is very, very hard, which is why, if you're somebody who's trying to get into the AAA industry, the way you show that is by completed game projects, or like if you're an artist, maybe you show completed character models, right? If you're an engineer, you show completed gameplay features, right? But you have to show a project, something that you've completed, that you've taken to the finish line, because trust me, that things get really, really hard as you go through these milestones. So anyway, caveat aside, coming back to my impact on milestones. Scope creep. Again, I can't stress this enough. I'm so glad Thomas wrote it up so early on in the slide. Don't let that happen to you. Of course, you'll make changes. Of course, there'll be iterations, but really think through why those changes matter. Why are those changes important? How are you going to implement those? And sometimes they may have an impact on your milestone, and that's okay. You can change your milestones. You can be like, hey, this is something that's important to the game, but it's going to take our team 2 extra weeks to implement this, and we want to make sure our QA team has time to test this. So we're going to just increase our timeline by 2 weeks, and we believe we can make it happen in 2 weeks, and have a plan for it, right? Again, I want to stress this a lot. Scope creep doesn't mean you cannot iterate on your features or can change things. It just means that you really need to be very cognizant about planning for it and understanding the why. Because scope creep will happen. You have to understand if it's worth it, if the juice is worth the squeeze. Now, scope creep is one thing, and then that can happen in every milestone. How does that actually, kind of translate to different milestones? So as I was talking about alpha, beta, and release milestones, each milestone will generally have different kind of scope creeps that can happen, which are common. Of course, more can happen, but these are some of the common scope creeps that I've personally seen. And for the alpha, you're always kind of going about and trying to change your features. You're like, okay, I have character movement set up, but I don't feel like it's fun. What if I did this, right? Or you have combat, you're setting up the environment and how your character interacts with the environment, how you interact with different, so let's say, materials, objects, and you don't like it, and you're like, I'm just gonna change it and try it out different things, right? That can really accelerate and kind of exponentially really increase your kind of milestone planning and how you're doing that. Beta milestone. So we talked about beta being content complete, right? If you've planned for 10 levels, you have 10 levels. Now, what if you're like, hey, I'm playing through the first 5 levels, I don't think they're fun, let me overhaul the first 5 levels entirely. Now, as a designer, as a level designer, you may think, hey, that's not a big deal, I can just move some stuff around. But think about it from your engineering team's point of view, right? They've kind of coded some things in, and the way they've set that up maybe requires them to go back and change how some features are set up. Maybe your art team is like, oh crap, I didn't optimize for this, right? Now my camera movements are completely different, so I have to call completely different objects. So I have to like break those models up in completely different ways, right? Your animation team is like, oh, I didn't plan for this because that camera angle couldn't show this particular part of the body or the environment, so I didn't set those up right? The cascading effect can be really, really large, especially I think within the content changes, if you don't think through this. Again, I can't stress enough. It's okay to make content changes. Just think about the impact on other teams. Think about the impact on your milestones, and think about the why. The why is the very important part, right? Because if you can really pinpoint and find the reason of what this iterative change is going to bring you for your game, for your product, for your application, it's okay to do so as long as you can plan for it and get your team on board. But if you can't, I would avoid it altogether.
And to add a note to that, just to think about, talking to some of the artists that were working on a bunch of different 3D games, sometimes if it's a 3D game and you're never going behind buildings, your artist may not create the back of the building because why, right? Work smart, not hard. And then suddenly imagine then you say, okay, cool, we want to make the city totally immersive in VR and we're going to walk around every building. You just created an entire asset pipeline for the entire city over again, right? So I think it's really important to think about the implications of decisions you make when you're making those decisions. That's all.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a good example, Thomas. Thank you. And then finally, release milestone. Let's say you're okay with all the features you have, you're okay with the content you have, your users are happy, and of course you're making iterative changes. But your publisher comes and says, hey, you know what? People aren't buying PS4s anymore. We want to release on PS5, and we don't want to change our date of release. That puts you in a very big pickle, and some of you may be like, oh, how big of a difference can it be from PS4 to PS5? It's a huge difference. It's completely different SDKs. You're using completely different APIs. Hardware is different, right? So maybe you've optimized for PS4 hardware, but you can't optimize for PS5 hardware, or you have to completely overhaul your PS5 architecture, right? These things can have a very material impact. They may sound very, very, easy to do when you're in the middle of things, but trust me, the kind of cascading effects, these kinds of changes have is enormous. Okay, so let's continue. Agility, agile development. So we talked about milestones. We talked about, hey, how to plan on executing your game. We talked about setting up milestones and how we're going to stay within those milestones and what can impact those milestones, right? Now we're going to discuss about how we tackle when we do want to make changes, right? Because I am probably a broken record by now, but I cannot stress this enough. Changes will happen. It's a matter of planning for them and understanding the why of them. And that's where agile development comes in. So, going back to waterfall in software engineering and software development, you finish one thing, that is a dependency on your second thing, and then you move on to the second thing, and then third thing, and so on and so forth, right? You'd imagine maybe, hey, games could work that way, right? We build content, we build all the characters, we build all the environment pieces, and we build all the terrain and the scene. Now we'll give it to the engineering team and they'll actually make it interactable. If you were to try to do something like that for game development, it would first take a very long time, because would your engineering team just be sitting idle while your concept team works? What about your animation team? Will they just kind of do fun projects while they're waiting for all other things to happen? So first of all, you can't work that way, right? You have to kind of figure out, hopefully through the pre-production process, you've really figured out what that process looks like, and your producer has really set up different tools to track that. Jira, Trello, Kanban. There's like a bunch of different methodologies, philosophies behind agile development and how to do it. And I'm not going to run through those. I just want to make sure that you understand that there are multiple ways of doing agile development. There are multiple ways of doing iteration within your project. And iteration is probably the most important thing when it comes to game development, because when you're garnering feedback from your QA, from public and public betas and private betas, right, friends and family betas, you're going to find that what you thought your user experience is going to be like, it may not turn out to be that way. And generally, these are small changes, changes that you can integrate into your pipeline. So you're going to do that. you're like, okay, but I planned my milestones where I had 6 weeks, and first 2 weeks was going to be feature A, second 2 weeks was going to be feature B, third 2 weeks was going to be feature C. Then I think you did your milestone planning incorrectly, because you have to leave some room for iteration in your milestone planning, right? So let's say you've identified that, hey, I have 3 features, each feature takes 2 weeks each. You're going to probably add another 2 weeks for iterative time, because you want to make sure you have time to address any issues. You want to make sure that, if things don't work out, you have time to kind of go back and really kind of tackle those issues as they show up. And that's where being conservative also comes in. So in this case, instead of giving yourself 8 weeks, and that's 2 weeks for iteration, you give yourself 2 extra weeks in case things don't go as planned, right? I don't know how many of you've done, development where everything went perfectly, but for me, it's almost never been the case, where I'm trying to build something and things just kind of fall in place and every milestone is met, and things just work out. That never happens, right? So it's important to leave that room for yourself, right? A lot of times you'll see publishers and they'll be like, hey, yeah, we're going to release in October 2022, and then you don't see the game. Then that moves to spring 2023, then that moves to fall 2023, right? That happens because you're not leaving room for yourself to be conservative and be iterative. And a lot of times what will happen is you give that date to a publisher because that's what you did your milestone planning. Your publisher is really trying to hold you to that date, right? The developers are like, oh crap, I need more time. But the publisher is like, no, I've already put marketing money into this. I've already spoke to different kind of agencies. I've done so much work in trying to put this out there. We have to release at this time, right? So it's, again, very important for you to be conservative when you're doing milestone planning. And I don't mean conservative just for the sake of conservative, right? Maybe the way you structure it is like, hey, we have bare necessities where this has to be done for our product to actually be released. But then you also have nice to have features, maybe Easter eggs, right? Let's say things do fall in place. Everything's perfect, but you just have an extra 6 weeks. Put some Easter eggs in there. Players really, really enjoy that, right? Maybe put an extra level in there. Players really, really enjoy that too. I saw that, Thomas. But yeah, so I think again, it's very important to do that. And then the fourth thing is, despite doing all of that, maybe things don't work out and your game isn't what you intended it to be. A lot of the times, I'm sure you've seen this, as day one patches come out, right? Or 2 months down the line, a big patch happens and that fixes everything. Because sometimes you've committed to dates after being conservative, after leaving room for iteration, but it didn't end up being complete at the end, and your publisher is holding you to your date. So you're like, okay, I'm just going to do the best I can for now, which is playable, which my players will at least be like, hey, I can see the effort being put in. I can see that what they're trying to go for, and you follow up with updates, right? You follow up with like, hey, I'm going to fix this thing. Things just didn't work out. So what I'm trying to say is, like, it's okay if things don't work out. Just plan for it and see what you can do to fix it.
Hey, we made it. We made it to the end. We did it. Like the cool thing about a community like this, in my opinion, is like these are just resources being generated that you can just have. And it's so valuable because even if you only learn one tiny thing or you learn 100 huge things, it's going to come back to you in 10 years. And you're going to be like, I'm so glad I was at, like, I can't tell you how many times I'm talking to somebody and they'll say something and it'll trigger a memory from like me sitting in a meeting at 20, which was a long time ago, and going, oh, I remember that. Let's talk about it this way. Like the perspective you're being given. So like huge shout out to the GGP crew for putting this together. That's amazing. These kind of resources need to be everywhere. So
yeah, plus one to that. I think it's so cool. I wish I also had similar kind of talks and then communities and learnings when I was in school. So such a nice way to kind of approach things. And also, I will say I'm pretty excited about the optimization talk, because my literal job before this job was to profile and optimize for some of our biggest studios that we work with at Unity. I can't speak which studios, but that was literally my job, and that's all I did, and I absolutely enjoyed doing it. It's a lot of maths and graphs, at least. I don't know if that's what we're going to show. I'm not going to give it away, but for me, it's an absolute blast doing that.
Yeah. And last pitch I'll do too, because I keep forgetting to talk about this. There's a bit.ly link in the chat. Everybody here, if you're a student, you have access to Unity for free, Unity Pro. Hit that link, put in your school email. We'll send you the code. You're good to go. Use that to develop. And yeah, I think we'll log off and catch you all pretty soon.